Hello, food enthusiasts, and welcome to another episode of the Future Foodcast. I'm Pam Miller, your host for today, and we have a really interesting guest with us. I think you're going to love his perspective on all things food. His name is Bryan Quoc, PhD, and he's a food scientist and a food industry consultant. He's also the author of 150 Food Science Questions Answered. Bryan, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here,
Yeah.
Pam.
Well, we hope that you can answer some questions for us today because being a food scientist is a really interesting line of work. And you've done several things within that. But what are you doing right now with your background?
Yeah, so I'm serving as a consultant. I'm helping a lot of people and entrepreneurs and startups in the plant-based space, in the cellular agricultural space, and really just I'm really fascinated and interested in flavors and the design of foods and like how can you create foods that are really really going to be something that people crave and desire because at the end of the day we all have to eat, but we like to eat what we love to eat. But at the same time, something that, helps the environment, helps, people become healthier, that sort of thing. So that's a real technical challenge that really fascinates me.
Yeah, well, those are a lot of goals to have all at one time, Bryan. And I know you're working a lot in the plant-based food space, and really finding the taste profile there is a challenge, wouldn't you say? I mean, that's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the history of humans and foods is really fascinating because, we've actually evolved mostly to eat meat because that's just the easiest way to get your calories. And so like every compound that's produced when you take meat and you throw it on the grill, you throw it on a fire because, we invented fire so long ago. We're just so adapted to experiencing those particular flavor compounds at like the most minute level, right? Like we can tell the difference because that's what our ancestors ate. So when you take something like a plant-based material and you're trying to incorporate it into our diet, a lot of plants are designed, but from an evolutionary perspective, to be taste bitter, to have toxins, have poisons. Most of the plants in the world are not very difficult, are very difficult to eat, and have a lot of fiber, have a lot of cellulose. And so the challenge has always been, how do you take a material like that and transform it into something that is very similar to something that is like muscle and tissue and blood, and that there's a lot that goes into that for sure.
Well, when you break it down into muscle and tissue and blood, it sounds like it doesn't sound nearly as appealing. I mean, meat doesn't sound nearly as appealing. I'm looking to eat the plants when you kind of give it to me in the individual parts. So I'm not
Right.
as excited, not as excited to eat meat moving forward. But so do you break the compounds down? Is that explain to me what you do as a food scientist?
Yeah, so because I actually work mostly remotely with a lot of the companies that are my clients, and really what I do is they'll give me sort of their formulation. I'll break it down, kind of see what's possible as far as if you take two components or multiple components or ingredients, and what's going to happen as far as when you sear it, when you heat it up, when you bake it, when you cook it, what are sort of the chemical processes that are involved, and which ones are going to really make a difference when you're talking about something like taste, or you're talking about aroma and flavor. And the chemistry is really complex because there's so many compounds that can be produced, and really only a good number of them, like maybe a handful of them, 100, 200, so far, really make the difference. And trying to get all the compounds that you can only find in plants to react the same way as something that's in meat, you're talking about really just dissecting really analytically, like this compound. And you don't really need a whole lot. That's the surprising bit, is that it's just enough to really hit some receptor in your nose or in your mouth that's like, yeah, I love it. Right. And there's so much that goes into that.
Well, it's interesting too, because in all the plant-based foods that are being produced, the protein alternatives like meat substitutes, we are trying to, because what I hear is you're trying to simulate what we already eat, because we're pretty much creatures of habit, aren't we? I mean,
Right.
go for something we're familiar with.
Right, right, absolutely. And it's worked really well for us. We've survived millions of years, doing what we do. And it's entrenched, right? Just genetically, biologically. And a lot of it is also memory, right? What you ate as a kid really dictates a lot of what you eat as an adult, mostly because, the psychology is there, but also your gut microbiome is there. What is in your stomach, the bacteria that live there. They do a lot to prod around, and they release neurotransmitters and say like, this is great. So whatever you have in there, they're going to keep wanting to eat, right? So
Okay, so really our body is working in that direction in a positive way when we give it the plant compounds. It's saying, hey, we know about these, or we've had these things before. That's really,
exactly.
that is so
Exactly.
interesting. How did you even get started in this plant-based space? Like, what did
Oh
you
man.
do that led you into this? I just think
Yeah.
it's interesting. Obviously, it's a big trend. I think it used to be more of a fad, but now it's definitely a trend. Wouldn't you say? We are.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, there's so many countries and different cultures that are trying to introduce more plant-based meat. Some of them intrinsically, I think of, randomly like Serbia, they actually don't eat very much meat as a European country. And so Nestle is starting to build, I think actually has already built a plant-based meat production facility over there. So there's different cultures that kind of crop out, and you don't realize that, plant-based eating has been around just as long as meat eating. So, but for me, as far as how I got into the space, it's a bit of a convoluted journey, so I'll shorten it up a bit. But after college, I was a little lost and didn't really know what to do. So I actually ended up walking across the country for about 2,000 miles as sort of like a refresher. And through that whole experience and journey, I was putting on as many calories as I possibly could, because you're burning up 4,000 or 5,000 calories per day walking 20 miles. And yeah, and every grocery store I went to, I was like, the selection is so minimal here in the United States, and I was so surprised by that. By the time I finished my journey, I just thought, the future is food. I really have to get into this space. So after kind of bouncing around, considering becoming a chemist, considering becoming a teacher, there's a lot of different occupations I kind of dabbled into. I eventually settled on getting a PhD in food science, and that was it's a bit of a slog. It's been a 5-year slog, and at the end, COVID hit, and I was graduating in the middle of the pandemic, and that was a fascinating experience. And I think along that, there's so many issues with food and climate. There's so many issues with, how we produce the food that we do. At the time I was actually studying plant-based compounds that have healthful benefits to you, specifically in garlic and onion. And there's actually a lot of intersection between the flavors that we love and also what's good for us. I was like, oh, this is a really interesting way for me to use that knowledge. I started contacting plant-based and cellular agricultural companies, and I just thought, I'm here, I'm available, I'm remote because of COVID. And so let's see what happens. And from there, it's been a fabulous journey. It's been great.
Well, that is really cool. I know that now you're definitely have moved on from onions and garlic. I'm sure that's part of what you're doing now, but it sounds like you did a lot of work with them and are expanding into lots of other things with your consultancy, different that you're working with. What other kinds of things are you investigating or is going on in the plant-based space that you might be involved with?
Yeah, one of the things that's really fascinated me, and I think it's mostly because I live now in the Pacific Northwest, is mushrooms and fungi, actually, because a lot of the things that we waste, or you end up landfilling because of it's not edible for humans, or it's has food safety concerns. A lot of that can be consumed by fungi, and we've eaten fungi for a while too. Mushrooms are a big part of our diet. We've used yeast for thousands and thousands of years to brew beer, and there's a whole lot of technology there that sort of has a huge potential to be used as sort of the next kind of food source, essentially, because we throw millions and millions of tons of material that is completely inaccessible to humans. But like I said, fungi can consume, they can, reuse and eventually become biomass that we can consume. And I think, there's a few startup companies that are involved in that. And I think that, that's potentially the future as well.
Wow, fungi. All right, let's just break this down. No pun intended. But so there's food, I wouldn't call it waste necessarily, but it's the excess that we can't really consume in the form that it's currently in. And you're saying that some of that can be repurposed essentially
Yep.
and utilized by fungi, then be made into edible or consumable food products. Is that
Absolutely
right?
That's right. That's
Absolutely.
right.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. Can you package that so that I don't know that what's in there, and then I'll just, I mean, you have a consumer issue with, you can't really tell people all that's happened to get that where it is. We do want traceability and transparency in our supply chain for our food. But then when it comes to fungi, I mean, people have a wall up against that sometimes. I love mushrooms, but this is a thought process. It's really cool and very sustainable, Bryan, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the challenges is that, like you said, especially in Western culture, we don't really have as much of a experience with fungi. I know in, East Asia, they love fungi. China is one of the largest producers of mushrooms, but they also use a lot of molds and they use a lot of, edible other microorganisms. But it's something that's also something that has to be introduced into Western culture. One of the most famous form of alternative meat that's a fungi is corn, which is spelled Quorn, and that's in the UK. They produced it back in the 80s. They were developing it because there was sort of fear of a protein shortage, and it just became, it's perfect because it has the texture of meat. It's edible. It doesn't produce toxins. They spend years developing it, and it's a commercial product, And to me, that's perfect because you can feed it pretty much whatever you want. As long as it's broken down, edible source, even if we humans can't eat it, as long as it's safe for us to, consume. I think that to me is, what we're probably going to be eating in the next 20, 30 years.
That is so interesting. So interesting. All right. So everybody stay tuned for the latest in fungi coming to you soon. But Bryan, I did want to ask you a couple things about your book, 150 food science questions answered. What were a question or two? What were your most fun or interesting questions that you answered, or some that you get asked a lot that our audience might be interested in knowing about?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that is kind of near and dear to my heart is the concept of umami. Like, what is umami? Like, why do we care about it? And it's sort of a buzzword that gets passed around, but really what it is it's just like sweet, sour, salt. It's one of the basic tastes, and essentially it's our ability to taste amino acids, specifically glutamic acid and aspartic acid. And proteins have tons of these amino acids. Essentially, it's your ability to recognize that, and it's been around for almost 500 million years. Like sharks had it, right? Like their ability to detect these amino acids is just sort of core to being alive, essentially, as a mammal or as a fish or a reptile. And at the end of the day, that's what drives us to eat a lot of our protein sources. And I think that the ability to recognize umami and to control it and to use it to our advantage is probably core to the whole experience of creating alternative proteins. Is what does it mean to be eating meat is part of that, and it's something that we've just been naturally selected for.
Yeah, well, I learned something new today. Umami, I've never even heard the word before. Thank you for sharing that with me, Bryan. I am smarter for having been with you today. That's for sure. Do you have another one you'd like to share with us by any chance?
Yeah, absolutely. This came from my my research and my PhD, which is like, why do onions make you cry, right? And it's That was actually, it took researchers a while to figure this one out, but it's a cascade of different processes. So like onions, they contain this amino acid. And as you can see, I'm really big on amino acids. It's an amino acid called cysteine sulfoxide. It's not one that's common in living beings. It's mostly just produced in species of alliums, so garlic, onion, chives, and so on and so forth. But these cysteine sulfoxides, when you cut or rupture the cells of an onion, they get released and they react with with an enzyme that the onion produces, and that generates a compound called sulfenic acid. The sulfenic acid is what's responsible for the flavor of onions and garlic. But the onion has one additional enzyme that converts the sulfenic acid into what they call lacrimatory factor, basically what makes you cry. And that's really volatile, and it stings, it hurts, and it's designed specifically so that the onion can protect itself, right? And it's so funny because, all these different processes and, these biochemistries, eventually end up being, we like the flavor of onion, right? Like, and it's because it has this amino acid. So, we're able to tolerate the sting of an onion, but actually onions are toxic to most mammals. So, you feed it to a dog or a cat, or, if a bird pecks at it, it's actually, a poison. But, we humans were like, hey, this is great.
Wow. I didn't know that either. I do know that I cry when I cut onions, and my oldest daughter really cries when she cut onions, much more sensitive than I am. And I bought her onion goggles. If you're listening to the podcast and not watching, like swim goggles that you put on, and they were onion goggles and they were bright pink. And honestly, I think it's the best gift I ever got her. I think she still has them, and it's 10 years later, and she loves them, and she wears them every time she cuts onions. I was cutting onions the other day. I don't know if I'm getting more sensitive to them or if it was just the kind of onion, but I just had more of a reaction than normal. And I had the thought in the back of my head, it's funny that you talked about this today, I need to buy some onion goggles so that or maybe put on some swim goggles for anybody at home that's a swimmer. Probably they would help do the same thing, just seal that eye socket a little bit so it doesn't get irritated. Thanks for sharing those fun facts with us, Bryan. You're really interesting. Amino acids are important, and I guess our body resonating with them and really recognizing them is really an important facet of the science work that you're doing to try to help with alternative proteins, right, with the plants.
Absolutely. I mean, most of all flavor eventually comes from amino acids, and like things that taste meaty, that taste sweet, baked, the taste of baked bread, like all that actually originates from reactions that amino acids have with sugars, with ribonucleotides, with fats. I mean, there's so much variety, there's so much possibility, and it's very mind-boggling. But at the same time, we have all these amazing tools. We have computer software, we have programming, we have machine learning, and you can use those to really break down and dissect a lot of these processes. I think the disconnect is you can't teach a machine what tastes good, right? At the end of the day, you got to have a human at the end, trying everything. And I think that's a challenge. And it also makes it very human, right? Like that's the art of these things is, you have chemical names and you have ideas and you have theories, but at the end of the day, it's someone sitting down and having a meal with their family, and you got to capture that. And if you can capture that, I think that's the biggest market value possible.
The experience of food, really. It's a cultural thing across the world. People gather around food. They share friendships and relationships around food. We celebrate around food. So it's a big deal. Well, thanks for your work that you're doing to try to give us some options in the world and help us also continue to be more sustainable. But I know you also have an eye for the future of food and where we might look next. I mean, we do have limited resources here. And what do you think, about some of the future of food and what might be happening there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, sort of the next century as far as the future of food, I think the biggest thing is I talk about amino acids, I talk about proteins, and they come from somewhere, right? And, a lot of it is from plants. metabolizing nitrogen, right? And that's, I think, is the sort of linchpin. And we had this sort of agricultural revolution when a Nobel laureate named Fritz Haber, he was a chemist, he was able to develop a technology to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which is a fertilizer. It allows plants to actually utilize nitrogen. Otherwise, they can't. Our atmosphere is made up 70% of nitrogen, but it's completely inaccessible. The only times that plants can use it is, either bacteria has to like force it into the molecules, or lightning strikes. Like that's about the two options here on Earth. And I think water is of course critical, but after you have all the water in the world, you still need nitrogen, and that's what we need. As far as that becomes a nutrient that's critical for the development of literally everything from muscle to brain tissue to so on and so forth. So when we talk about the future, you're talking about how do you get enough nitrogen so that everyone can eat, right? I think we're good on sugar, we're good on carbohydrates. Like we have a problem with carbohydrates, in fact, right? So, but how much more nitrogen can we get, in the world? And I think that requires so many fields, so many sub-disciplines, so much scientific, knowledge and technology. But also, it also requires policy. It requires, understanding of the intimate relationship that we have with, our resources, the ecosystem. And then if you really, project out in the future, what do we do when we're in space? Like nothing. There's very few things that produce nitrogen out there, right? We have everything that we need here on Earth, but if you take it out into space, we're the ones who are going to be responsible for that sort of production. And every little bit counts, and every little bit needs to be recycled. And we don't do that here on Earth. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that at the end of the day, it all goes to the ocean. It's almost impossible to recover that. So we need systems to sort of bring back the nitrogen, get it back into the soil, and not just nitrogen, but minerals, metals, very small nutrients, micronutrients that, we just keep extracting over and over again. And it's costly. And we can see the challenges now today with, the Ukraine-Russian war, where we don't have access to those fertilizers, those nutrients, those minerals, and it drives up the price. And as we continue to drive up the prices, people are going to be less and less able to eat and purchase food at a reasonable cost. So I think that's the next step, is figuring out ways to sustainably close the loop, and that's going to require a lot. More than just technology. It's going to require people working together and policies to really make that work.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I know that it's nice that technology keeps investigating, innovating, and finding new ways and better processes and all of that. So hopefully that whole nitrogen as the linchpin problem, maybe we'll get that solved in another 50 years, or things seem to speed up, so it might be faster. Well,
absolutely.
We've covered lots of really fun stuff. You're a really amicable food scientist, I must say.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Very fun to talk to. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before we go today?
Yeah, I think, wow. I mean, it's been a crazy, it's been crazy last couple of years. And I think the food industry is so fascinating. I'm so glad that there are people who are passionate and interested in this space. And I think there's just going to be more and more people. And, unfortunately, I think your traditional, college curriculum, your traditional educational curriculum doesn't really put a lot of emphasis on it, and when you think food scientists, you think, some people think a nutritionist, some people think, agricultural technologists, and really we sit in a really interesting and fascinating subdiscipline, because we have to combine all sorts of different, chemistry, biology, biotechnology, a little bit of engineering thrown in. And it's, I think that's really fascinating and exciting, especially because it has to deal with people. We all have to eat at the end of the day. And I love that.
Well, maybe there are going to be some future food scientists who listen to this podcast and think, hey, what he is doing sounds really interesting to me. And hopefully you've sparked some interest for somebody to investigate the field, because we surely do need more smart people that are passionate like you are working in this field. I really appreciate you being with us on the Future Foodcast today, Bryan.
Thank you, Pam. I also appreciate being here today. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening to Future Foodcast. Future Foodcast is powered by Farm to Plate, the leading food blockchain platform. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date with the very latest innovations in the food industry.